Among all the men and women responsible for spreading Pentecostalism worldwide, few were as successful and well-respected as American evangelist John G. Lake. Lake was the organizer and leader of the Apostolic Faith Mission, AFM, which played a crucial role in converting a large number of people in South Africa. Using the AFM as a platform, Lake also propagated the Zionist doctrines of Illinois cult leader John Alexander Dowie. In 1992, Pentecostal historian Allan Anderson suggested that nearly half of Southern African Christians were adherents of Lake's Pentecostal and Zionist beliefs. Lake was apparently baptized in the Holy Spirit, according to Pentecostal faith, in October 1907, and was one of the original Pentecostal evangelists who knew William Seymour personally. Like many of the original leaders of the movement who visited Azusa Street, Lake gained overnight respect from all who were seeking the same blessing, and became known to many Pentecostals as a hero of the faith. His legacy has been immortalized through the work of leaders in the new Apostolic Reformation. Books such as God's Generals portray Lake as a man whose mission was inspired by God himself. But are these portrayals of John G. Lake accurate? Was his mission to South Africa the result of Lake's alleged baptism in the Holy Spirit? To find out, we must first examine how Lake initially came into contact with the apostolic faith during an unusual and long-forgotten event in history. In September 1905, cult leader and self-proclaimed manifestation of the Old Testament prophet Elijah, Reverend John Alexander Dowie, suffered a severe stroke that left him paralyzed. By December, it was clear he could no longer lead his communal city of Zion and was forced to surrender leadership. With an empire worth several $1 million at stake, Zion City soon became the target of several opportunists aiming to seize Dowie's throne. Before long, the city was flooded with men claiming to be the new prophet to replace Dowie's Elijah. One such opportunist was Pentecostal founder Charles Fox Parham. Parham had started a small cult of his own modeled after Dowie's communal city of Zion and Frank Sanford's Shiloh compound, but was struggling to gain converts on the scale of the two prototypes. Seizing the moment, Parham left his group in Topeka and began holding tent meetings in Zion in an attempt to capture some of the fallout from Dowie's sudden loss of power. During those revivals, Parham began to claim that he, like Dowie, was a manifestation of Elijah the prophet. His success seemed unlikely until some of Zion's elders decided to side with Parham over Zion's general overseer, Wilberforce. Among those who joined Parham were two key figures in the Pentecostal movement. The first was Fred Francis Bosworth, one of the original founders of the Assemblies of God and a faith healer who mentored William Branham during the latter rain revivals. The second was John G. Lake. Parham convinced his small group of followers in Zion that the end of days was near. Before long, the Parhamites began performing exorcisms, as well as engaging in a range of ecstatic and unusual sexual behaviors. In an unrelated incident in Texas, Parham was arrested for sexual crimes against a young man. During his incarceration, the group continued to radicalize. The resulting hysteria ended in several murders, some of which appeared to have been covered up by the Zion coroner. One woman was tortured in a failed exorcism and died from the extreme pain of having several of her bones snapped by the religious fanatics. This led to criminal trials, during which several Parhamites fled Zion. It was during this time that Lake claimed to have had a series of visions that convinced him to leave his wealth and possessions behind and begin his mission in South Africa. The criminal activity in Zion by the Parhamites resulted in an angry crowd with a thirst for revenge. As the lynch mob began to form, Wilberforce declared that Parham, John G. Lake, and Parhamite elder Tom Hesmelhulch were to blame for the murders in Zion. Before fleeing to South Africa, Lake and Hesmelhulch temporarily sought refuge in the small community of Pentecostals in Indianapolis. Lake, Bosworth, and Hesmelhulch gained an audience with former Parhamite, William Joseph Seymour, and convinced Seymour to help raise funds for a mission trip to South Africa. The group organized a conference in January 1908, and Lake soon became untouchable by any inquiry into the Zion murders. Upon reaching Africa, Lake recounted a series of visions that he allegedly had prior to his involvement with Porham. He claimed that the glory of God overshadowed the work done in Zion City, and that his participation in the group was the result of an audible voice from God, asking, "Will you go?" That same voice allegedly led him to Indianapolis and then to Johannesburg. No mention was made of Lake's first disastrous attempt at a Pentecostal ministry in Zion, nor of the sexual misconduct Porham admitted to during the criminal trials that followed. Instead, Lake proclaimed Porham's new faith as though it were inspired by God. Throughout South Africa, Lake engaged in a host of religious scams he had apparently learned from John Alexander Dowie and others. Lake and his family were instrumental in convincing audiences of Dowie's faith cure, and some of the alleged cures were simply outlandish. In one instance, Lake claimed that his sister had 5 cancers and that he himself reached into her chest and pulled out black tumors. Some scams involved Lake's family standing by to send a telegram of their alleged healing, while Dowie claimed that he was remotely administering a faith cure. According to the written record of the events, Lake, his brother, 2 of his sisters, 3 sons, and his wife were all rescued from near death multiple times over the course of just 8 years. It should come as no surprise that Lake's healing revival meetings frequently featured distant healings, unstage extraction of tumors, and more. John Lake briefly returned to Chicago in 1909, when one of his lovers from Johannesburg visited Chicago with a group of missionaries from Africa. Police officers removed 17-year-old Carol Goodenough from intimate conversations with Lake at the Rock Island depot. They later learned that Goodenough was the daughter of the superintendent of the Congregational Church to the Zulus. Scholars who are critical of Lake's ministry side with Goodenough as brother, who alerted the police that more had happened between the 2 lovers than met the eye. According to the critical analysis of Lake's testimony, Lake made many claims about his past that were questionable and failed to mention that he was a leading member of the murderous sect in Zion City. Lake claimed to be a newspaper reporter, a real estate and insurance man in Chicago, and a superintendent of agents for the People's Life Insurance Company, none of which can be verified. He then claimed to be engaged to the 17-year-old and that her brother's claims against the 2 were unfounded, though the 2 had no plan for elopement. Regardless of whether the event was a tryst between lovers or an actual engagement, Lake and Goodenough never married. In 1913, Lake apparently felt that enough time had passed to allow his safe return to the United States, and he returned to marry Florence Switzer, his second wife. The 2 avoided Illinois, and after a series of evangelistic revivals, eventually landed in Spokane. There, he began an attempt to recreate Dowie's faith-healing empire. He might have succeeded had he and members of his family not been further exposed by the news media for fraudulent and criminal activities. In 1922, Lake and his son were charged with committing securities fraud in a scheme involving his church. It was then made public that Lake had been using the church as a means to sell mining stocks and had been selling worthless stocks to church members. A few weeks later, Lake attempted to seize property while impersonating a police officer and was arrested as he left the pulpit in his church. Soon after, he was held on federal charges of failing to report a communicable disease. Lake's fraudulent activities in Spokane did very little to change his legacy. Members of the original Porhamite sect in Zion were able to salvage his ministry as an evangelist, and the ministries of key figures in the latter rain movement were a direct result of Lake's influence. Gordon Lindsay, William Branham's campaign manager during the latter rain revivals, was also converted to the Porhamite sect by Charles Fox Porham himself and soon joined Lake on revival tours. Most likely through his connection to Porhamite F.F. Bosworth and his work with the Assemblies of God, Lake soon became an evangelist for the Assemblies and spread the doctrines of Porham and Dowie throughout the United States. His legacy lives on today in the new Apostolic Reformation. Though the stage presence of the faith healers has changed significantly from the early 1900s, and the faith healers have found new gimmicks to attract crowds with itching ears, it is very apparent that the motives and objectives remain the same. While there are people willing to give their hard-earned money to the entertainer will certainly be willing to take it from them.